She built $1 billion empire from nothing, brilliant, fearless, untouchable. He mopped floors in her building and said nothing. No one knew they were married. No one knew the janitor everyone mocked had once pulled 16 hostages out of a burning compound in Kandahar without losing a single life. Until the night the garage lights went dark, and men with guns called her Mrs. Hayes. If you're new here, hit subscribe and follow this story to the end, because what happens next will gut you. Drop a like and tell me your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm on Natalie Sterling's phone went off at 4:47 every morning, and every morning she silenced it before the second buzz. Not because she was already awake, though she usually was, but because she didn't want to disturb the man sleeping beside her. Logan didn't sleep deeply. He never had. The slightest sound and his eyes would open clear and alert, like a machine switching on. It was one of the things about him that had taken her longest to stop finding unnerving, and one of the things she had eventually come to find quietly beautiful. He was always present. Even in sleep, some part of him was watching the door. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the apartment they shared in a building 40 minutes from her headquarters. Nobody from work knew she lived here. Nobody from work knew this apartment existed. The lease was in Logan's name, same as the car registered to a P.O. box in New Jersey, same as the phone she used when she called him from the office. Prepaid, purchased with cash, replaced every few months. His idea, originally. Her compliance, eventually. The ceiling had a water stain near the window that had been there since October. She'd meant to have it fixed and kept forgetting, the way you forget things that exist only in the quiet hours before real life starts. Logan's breathing shifted beside her. He was already waking. "You didn't sleep," he said. Not a question. "I slept fine." "You've been awake for 20 minutes. She turned her head. He was looking at the ceiling too, one arm folded behind his head. 37 years old, with the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable in meetings. His face had lines that hadn't been there in the photograph she'd first seen of him. The one a mutual friend had texted her 18 months ago with the message, "You should meet this guy. No, seriously, just meet him." And his left shoulder had a scar the shape of a fishhook that he'd explained once and never mentioned again. "I have the Mercer Group presentation at 8, she said. "I know. And the board call at 2. "I know that too. I was running through it." He turned his head toward her, and something in his expression was careful and quiet in a way she didn't particularly want to examine at 4:47 in the morning. "How's Ellie?" she asked, to shift direction. "Good. She has a history test today. She was nervous about it last night." "She'll do fine. She's sharp." "She is." He paused. "She asked about you again." Natalie said nothing. "She wanted to know if you were coming to her recital next month." His voice was even. He was good at keeping his voice even. "I told her you had a busy schedule." "Logan, I'm not starting anything. I'm just telling you what she asked." She sat up and reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. 10 years old, Ellie Hayes had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's stubborn jaw, and she had decided approximately 6 months ago that she loved Natalie with a ferocity that made Natalie feel simultaneously warmed and terrified. Ellie brought her drawings. Ellie saved the good parts of movies to re-watch with her. Ellie once spent 45 minutes explaining the entire plot of a fantasy novel she'd read because she thought Natalie would like it. Natalie hadn't gone to a single school event. She told herself it was caution. She told herself it was smart. She was starting to understand there was a different word for it. Sterling Biotech occupied 14 floors of a glass tower in downtown Philadelphia. Natalie had chosen Philadelphia specifically, not New York, not Boston, not the obvious choices, because she'd grown up in a row house in Kensington, which was 5 miles away and might as well have been a different country, and she'd wanted to be able to see it from her office window on days she needed reminding of why she worked the way she worked. She arrived at 7:15, which was early by other executives' standards and late by hers. The lobby was already filling. Security nodded. The elevator bank opened immediately, as it always did when she walked in. Some building protocol that had been implemented without her asking, and that she'd never bothered to reverse. She had almost made it to the elevator when she heard Victor Langford's voice from across the lobby. Budget justification. That's all I'm saying. Every department submits one. Facilities shouldn't be exempt. He was standing near the reception desk with two members of his team, coffee in hand, speaking at a volume just loud enough to ensure anyone within 30 feet could hear him. Victor Langford was 51, Senior VP of Corporate Strategy, Yale MBA, and possessed of the specific variety of confidence that comes from having never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. The man he was speaking to, technically at, since speaking to implied acknowledgement, was pushing a mop through a small puddle near the revolving door. Logan didn't look up. Honestly, Victor continued, glancing at his colleagues with a small smile, I can never tell if we're paying the cleaning crew or if they just wander in. One of the colleagues laughed. The other looked at his phone. Logan wrung out the mop. His jaw was set the way it got when he was deciding not to respond to something. Natalie had learned to read that particular set of his jaw. She'd seen it 100 times in this lobby, in these hallways, in the break room on the 4th floor, where someone had once complained to HR that the custodian was making the space feel uncomfortable by eating lunch there. She pressed the elevator button. She did not say anything. The doors opened. She stepped inside. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Logan, alone now, finishing the puddle methodically, not looking at her or at Victor, or at anyone at all. The floor number lit up as the elevator rose, and Natalie kept her eyes forward and breathed through her nose and told herself the thing she always told herself, which was that it was complicated, and that the complications were real, and that she had reasons. The Mercer Group presentation went well. The board call went long. A crisis with a supplier in Ohio ate up most of the afternoon. At 3:40, she got a text from the prepaid phone she kept in her desk drawer. Ellie got a 94 on the history test. She sat back in her chair and read it twice. Then she typed back, "Tell her that's fantastic. Tell her I said so." A pause. Then, "I will. She'll want to hear it from you directly, though." She put the phone back in the drawer. At 5, she had a meeting with Marcus Webb, her head of communications, about a profile piece that a national magazine was trying to schedule. They wanted photographs in her apartment, which meant the apartment nobody knew about, which meant a different apartment needed to be arranged, which meant a storage unit in Rittenhouse Square that held enough furniture to dress a one-bedroom to look like somewhere she lived. She'd done this once before and found the whole exercise exhausting in a way she couldn't explain to Marcus without explaining everything else. "They're specifically asking for something personal," Marcus said. He was 43 and professionally enthusiastic in a way that wore on her by the end of the day. "Readers want to see who you are outside the office. A plant, a coffee mug, whatever. Something that makes you look human." "I am human." "I know that. They don't. That's the problem." He checked his notes. "They also want to ask about your personal life. Whether you're seeing anyone. You've deflected that in every interview for 3 years." "I'll deflect it again. Natalie." He set down the notes. At a certain point, the deflection becomes the story. People fill in blanks. Right now, the blanks they're filling in aren't great. "What blanks?" "That you're too cold to have a life outside this building. That the company is a substitute." He said it gently, the way people say things they think you need to hear. "I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying that's what's out there." She looked at him for a moment. "Set up the shoot. I'll use the Rittenhouse place." Marcus nodded and let it go, because she paid him to let things go at a certain point, which was the only reason she'd kept him for 4 years. She found Logan in the sub-basement at 6:15 doing inventory on a supply closet that someone had apparently reorganized without labeling anything. He had a clipboard and a small flashlight because the overhead fixture had been out for 2 weeks, and when she pushed open the door, he turned automatically, the flashlight beam finding her face for half a second before he lowered it. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She looked at the shelves. "The light's still broken?" "Submitted the work order 3 weeks ago." "I'll say something to facilities." "Don't." His voice was quiet. "It draws attention." She understood what he meant. For the last 18 months, Logan Hayes had constructed an entire professional existence around the principle of invisibility. He arrived early and left late. He worked quickly and quietly. He remembered names and shift schedules and which executives liked which floors cleaned at which hours. He was by any measure that didn't involve tactical combat training very good at being a janitor. He had told her once that it wasn't different from field work. You learned the rhythms of a place until you could move through it like water. She had laughed when he said it, and then she had thought about it for a week afterward and stopped laughing. "I heard Langford this morning," she said. "In the lobby." Logan made a small sound that wasn't quite a response. "I should have said something." "You don't need to fight my battles, Natalie." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "You're my husband. When someone talks to you like that, I shouldn't just get on the elevator." He looked at her steadily. The flashlight was down by his side now, casting strange upward shadows. "How many people in this building know that?" She didn't answer. "Right," he said. Not sharp, not accusing, just careful, the way he was always careful, the way he had learned to be careful with her about this particular subject, because he knew that pushing her didn't work and that she had to find the edge of it herself. She hated that he was patient about it. It would have been easier if he was angry. "Ellie's recital is the 12th, he said. "I know. It's a Saturday. There's no board meeting." "Logan, I'm not saying you have to announce anything. I'm just saying it's a Saturday and she's been practicing for 6 weeks and she'd like you to be there." He looked back at the shelf he was cataloging. "That's all I'm saying." She stood in the doorway of the broken-lit closet and watched him write something on the clipboard and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that wasn't either a promise or an evasion, and she was tired of the evasions but terrified of the promises. "I'll try," she finally said. He nodded. He didn't say "I've heard that before," even though they both knew he was thinking it. The underground parking garage beneath Sterling Biotech occupied 2 levels and was accessed through a keycard checkpoint at the corner of Market and 6th. Natalie had a reserved space on level 1, near the elevator, because she arrived early and left late, and the space had come with the building lease and she had never thought about it as a security risk. She thought about it at 8:14 that evening, when she was walking to her car with her laptop bag over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, and the lights went out. Not flickered, not dimmed. Out. The whole level, all at once, like a hand over a candle. She stopped walking. The backup generator should have kicked in within 3 seconds. She counted. 4 seconds. 5. Nothing. Facilities issue, she told herself quietly, because the alternative was to think about the fact that the backup generator in a 14-story commercial building does not simply fail to engage. She heard footsteps. 2 sets. Not rushed. Deliberate. She turned toward the elevator, which was 40 feet behind her now, and a figure stepped into the space between her and it. She couldn't see his face. She could see he was large and that he was wearing something over his face and that he was not a Sterling Biotech employee. She opened her mouth to say something. She didn't know what. Some instinct toward language, toward reason. And a second figure came from behind a car to her left and said, very calmly, "Don't. Just come with us. Mrs. Hayes." The name stopped her completely. Not Ms. Sterling, not Natalie, not even some generic address that might have come from reading her name off a lanyard or a parking permit. Mrs. Hayes. 3 other people knew that name. Logan, Ellie, and the clerk at the municipal building in a small county courthouse in upstate New York, where they'd been married 14 months ago, in a proceeding that had lasted 11 minutes and involved no guests and no reception, and a set of rings that Logan kept in a locked box in his nightstand. The figure behind her took hold of her arm, and Natalie Sterling, who had built a billion-dollar company from a rented office and a second-hand server rack and 4 years of work that had cost her 2 relationships and her 20s, understood in that instant that whatever came next would not be something she could solve with a presentation or a board meeting or a well-drafted press release. She looked at the ceiling of the dark garage, at the dead lights, and she thought of Logan in a broken-lit closet writing on a clipboard. Then the bag went over her head, and the sound of the city disappeared. The first thing Logan noticed when he came up from the sub-basement was that the elevator on the east side of the building wasn't moving. It was a small thing, the kind of thing nobody else would have registered, but Logan had spent 18 months learning the rhythms of this building, the way he'd once learned the rhythms of compounds in places that didn't appear on commercial maps. And he knew that Natalie always took the east elevator from the parking level at the end of the day because it opened closest to her reserved space. The west elevator had a half-second delay on the doors that she found irritating. She'd mentioned it once, early on, and he'd filed it away the way he filed everything away. The east elevator hadn't moved in 40 minutes. He stood in the hallway outside the supply room with his clipboard still in his hand and looked at the indicator panel above the elevator doors and felt the specific quality of stillness that had kept him alive in bad situations. Not panic, not rush, just the sudden, complete attention of a mind that had learned to take small wrongnesses seriously. He pulled out his phone, called Natalie's cell. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. He called the prepaid number. Same result. He set the clipboard down on top of the nearest trash cart and walked to the stairwell at the end of the hall. And as he pushed through the door, he was already running the numbers. Time she'd left the office, approximately 8, maybe 8:10. Time now, 8:47. Travel time to the parking level, 4 minutes if she stopped to talk to someone, 2 if she didn't. Her car was a black Audi on level 1, space 14. She never deviated from that route. He took the stairs down. The door to the parking level was propped open with a rubber wedge, not unusual during the day, completely unusual at this hour. He came through it low, body angled, one hand out, and stopped. The backup lights were running, which meant the main power had failed and restored. Pale emergency yellow cast the concrete in flat, sickly light. 3 cars remained on the level, none of them Natalie's. Near the center of the lane, approximately where a person would walk from the elevator to space 14, one of her shoes lay on its side. A single pump. Black. 2-inch heel. He crouched and looked at the floor. There were scuff marks in the grime, not the long drag marks of someone unconscious, but the shorter, churned marks of someone who'd struggled briefly and then been moved quickly. Professionals. 2 sets of boot prints, men's, size 10 and 11 roughly, moving toward the vehicle ramp. He stood up. He didn't touch the shoe. He walked back to the stairwell, pulled out his phone, and called a number he hadn't dialed in 14 months. It rang twice. Hayes? The voice on the other end was flat and careful in the way of someone who answered unknown numbers with their last name because first names were a kind of vulnerability. "It's me," Logan said. A pause. "It's been a while. I need to know if anything's moved on Damien Cross in the last 6 months." The pause this time was longer. When the voice came back, it was quieter. "Where are you right now?" "Philadelphia, my wife's building." "You're—" Another pause. "You got married?" "Not the point. Cross. What do you know?" "Logan." The voice dropped further. "We got intelligence 8 weeks ago that Cross had relocated. Eastern Seaboard. There was a pattern in his communication intercepts that looked like he was building toward something, but nobody could identify the target. We flagged it and passed it up, and then..." A long exhale. "Then it went quiet and command decided he was probably running a trafficking route, not a personal op." Logan looked at the scuff marks on the concrete floor, at the single black shoe. "They were wrong," he said. He ended the call. Damien Cross had built his organization the way termites build a structure, from the inside out, invisibly, until the day the floor gives way and you realize the whole thing was hollow all along. Logan had first encountered him during an op in the Gulf of Aden in 2016 when Cross's syndicate had been running kidnap for ransom operations targeting NGO workers and mid-level executives of Western energy companies. It was careful, surgical work. Cross never went after high-profile targets because high-profile targets drew military response. He went after the people nobody sent rescue teams for, extracted money quietly, and released his victims alive because alive hostages were a business model and dead ones were a liability. Logan's team had dismantled the Gulf operation over the course of 11 months. They'd rolled up the network from the bottom, working through intermediaries and handlers until they'd identified the top 4 organizational leaders. 3 of them had been captured in a coordinated operation outside Djibouti. The 4th, Damien Cross, had walked out of a hotel in Doha 40 minutes before the teams arrived, which meant someone had warned him, which was a problem that had never been fully resolved. Cross had spent the next 3 years rebuilding. Different geography, different structure, different personnel. The intelligence community had tracked him periodically. Morocco, then Portugal, then a gap of 18 months where he'd vanished entirely. But rebuilding a kidnapping network required patience and capital, and Cross apparently had both. What he also had was a very long memory. Logan knew this because in the weeks before he'd left the Navy, a counterintelligence officer had sat across from him in a windowless room in Virginia and said, very directly, "Cross blames you specifically, not your team, you." He had a source inside the Djibouti operation who identified you by name before the source was burned. "We recommend you consider your post-service plans carefully." Logan had listened to this, and then he'd driven home to the apartment in Arlington where Ellie was staying with a neighbor, and he'd sat on the edge of his daughter's bed while she slept and thought for a long time about what careful plans looked like when you had a 10-year-old who needed stability more than she needed a father who was tactically interesting. He'd chosen the janitor job 6 months later. Not randomly. He'd identified Sterling Biotech as a secure location, a major corporate headquarters with multiple entry points, full security infrastructure, and enough foot traffic to make a low-profile presence completely unremarkable. He'd met Natalie through a friend before any of this, and what had developed between them had complicated everything in ways he hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. He told himself the job was about keeping Ellie safe, staying invisible while Cross rebuilt and his name faded from whatever watch list the syndicate maintained. He'd mostly believed it. Standing in the parking garage now, looking at the shoe, he understood that invisible had never been an option. Cross hadn't lost the thread. He'd simply been waiting for the right moment to pull it. Logan went back upstairs, not to the sub-basement, but to the 5th floor, where the building's secondary security office was located. The main security hub was on the lobby level, staffed by contracted personnel who answered to Sterling Biotech's head of corporate security, a man named Adrian Cole, who had been hired 8 months ago and who Logan had never liked without being able to articulate exactly why. There was something off about Cole. Not dramatic. Nothing you could point to in a performance review or a background check. He was ex-law enforcement, credentialed, professional in his speech. But in 18 months of watching people move through this building, Logan had developed a sharp sense for who paid attention to what. And Cole paid attention to the wrong things. He cataloged executives. He noted relationships. He kept his eyes on the board members when they visited, not on the exits. The 5th floor office was a secondary node, monitoring feeds from the garage, the loading dock, and the 2 service entrances. It was staffed at night by a single person, usually a junior contractor named Dennis, who was 26 and spent most of his shift watching sports highlights on a separate tab. Logan pushed the door open. Dennis was not watching sports highlights. Dennis was on the phone, turned away from the monitors, speaking quietly with the particular hunch-shouldered posture of someone who didn't want to be overheard. "Yeah. Level 1 cleared on schedule, maybe 10 more minutes before anyone—" He turned and saw Logan and stopped. "Who are you talking to?" Logan said. Dennis straightened. "That's not... This is a restricted area. You're not supposed to be in here." "I'm aware." Logan stepped inside and let the door close behind him. "Who are you talking to?" "I don't have to answer that. You're maintenance. You don't have clearance for this floor." Logan looked at the monitors. The garage feeds on levels 1 and 2 were dark. Not offline, they showed a live timestamp, but the image itself was a clean, flat gray. Someone had looped them. He knew what looped feeds looked like. He'd used them himself in a different life. "The garage cameras on level 1, Logan said. "When did they go dark?" Dennis glanced at the monitors and then back at Logan, and something shifted in his face. A small, involuntary tell, the eyes going slightly wider before he got control of it again. "There's a technical issue. It's being resolved." "By who?" "By the IT department. At 8:50 at night. They work—" "Stop." Logan's voice was quiet. Not loud, not aggressive, just entirely still in a way that seemed to change the temperature of the room slightly. He'd learned that tone in places where raising your voice got people killed. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Who were you on the phone with just now?" Dennis's jaw worked. He was scared, genuinely scared, not professionally uncomfortable, which meant he was small in this, a contractor paid to do one thing and not fully briefed on what that thing was connected to. Logan had seen that specific look on people before. It didn't make them innocent, but it made them a different category of problem. "Cole," Dennis finally said. "It was Adrian Cole." Logan held his eyes for a moment. Then he crossed to the monitoring station, pulled the USB drive from the secondary backup port, the one that ran on a separate circuit from the main feed, the one that the person who'd looped the garage cameras hadn't known about or had decided wasn't worth disabling, and put it in his pocket. "Don't call anyone for the next 10 minutes, Logan said. "I have to report, you're going to have a lot of choices to make in the next 48 hours about which side of this you want to be on. I'd start making good ones now." He moved toward the door. 10 minutes. He left Dennis standing in front of the dark monitors and took the stairs 2 at a time, going up. Tunk. He called his contact back from the 7th floor landing. "The USB drive from the secondary backup in the security room. I need you to tell me if you have anyone local who can pull footage." "Logan, I'm not in a position to—" "She's my wife," Logan said. "They took her 40 minutes ago, and they used her married name, which means this was built on intelligence about me, which means Cross has been inside this organization for longer than tonight. I need the footage, and I need it fast." A long silence. Then, "Send me a photo of the drive. I'll see what I can do." He sent the photo. Then he kept walking. The executive floor was quiet at this hour, most offices dark, the cleaning crew done for the night. Logan moved through it without turning on lights. He knew this floor by feel, the slight give in the carpet near the conference room door, the way the air conditioning cycled louder on the south side. He'd cleaned this floor 300 times in 18 months, and he'd paid attention every single one. Victor Langford's office was in the northeast corner, which was not the corner with the best view, but was the corner closest to the board meeting room and the server room access point, which Logan had always thought was a deliberate choice for someone who positioned himself as a strategist. The office was dark. Logan tried the door, locked, the electronic kind, and then crouched and looked at the gap beneath it. A faint light. Not overhead. Desk, lamp, or phone. He straightened and moved to the assistant station outside the office, sat down, and opened the scheduling system on the desktop. He had the login because he used it to coordinate cleaning windows, which nobody had thought to restrict because nobody thought about what a janitor might do with a scheduling calendar. He pulled up Langford's calendar for the past 6 weeks. 3 meetings with Adrian Cole that weren't coded to any project number. 2 board calls requested outside the normal cycle. A dinner reservation at a restaurant in Center City on the same evening that Natalie had last spoken publicly about the Mercer acquisition. The acquisition that, if it went through, would make a takeover of Sterling Biotech significantly more expensive for any external party. Logan sat back and looked at the screen. He'd been watching this building for 18 months, and he'd been watching it the way a person watches a place they love, looking for threats at the perimeter, at the entry points from outside. He hadn't thought enough about what was already inside. His phone buzzed. A text from his contact. "Drive is readable. Sending you a clip." The clip was 43 seconds of footage from the garage level 1, time-stamped 8:09 p.m. It showed Natalie walking from the elevator toward her car. It showed 2 men emerge, one from behind a support column, one from between a parked SUV and the wall. It showed one of them say something and Natalie stop walking. It showed the brief struggle, the bag going over her head, the way they moved her toward a service exit that Logan knew led to an alley that ran behind the building and connected to a loading area on 6th Street. It also showed, in the corner of the frame, a third figure standing near the exit door, holding it open, wearing a Sterling Biotech security badge. Logan enlarged the frame as much as the image quality allowed. The third figure was Adrian Cole. He set the phone down on the desk and sat very still for 30 seconds. Outside the window, Philadelphia carried on, indifferent and lit up and enormous. Somewhere out there, in a direction he didn't yet know, Natalie was in a room with people who had used her married name because they wanted him to come for her. They knew how he thought. They'd built the bait to his specifications, which meant they'd also built a trap to his specifications. He thought about Ellie, who was at home with a neighbor named Rosa, who sometimes watched her when Logan worked late, doing homework at the kitchen table or already asleep, hair spread across the pillow the way it had been since she was 3 years old. He thought about the history test she'd gotten a 94 on. He thought about the recital on the 12th, a Saturday, when she'd been practicing for 6 weeks. He pulled up his contact list and called Rosa. "Hey, Rosa, I'm going to be later than I thought tonight. Can you stay over?" He kept his voice exactly level. "Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you." A pause. Hey, can you make sure the front door's dead-bolted? Both locks. Thanks. He ended the call. Then he went to the janitor's supply room on the 7th floor, the one nobody came to after 6 because the executive bathrooms were serviced at 4. He had a locker there. Nothing dramatic inside, work clothes, the tools of the job, a change of shoes. But beneath the false bottom he'd installed 3 weeks after taking this position, in a building whose blueprints he'd studied before he ever applied for the job, there was a go bag. He'd hoped, genuinely hoped, that the go bag would rot in that locker until he dismantled it himself. He opened it now and checked the contents with the practiced efficiency of muscle memory. Everything was where it should be. Of course it was. He'd built the bag and he'd checked it monthly, and it had been ready the whole time, the way you keep a fire extinguisher you hope you never use but cannot afford to leave empty. He changed out of the janitor's uniform, folded it carefully, and set it on top of the locker. He didn't throw it down or leave it crumpled on the floor. He'd worn it for 18 months, and it had meant something. Not what Victor Langford thought it meant, not the diminishment that Cole's kind of person assumed it represented, but something real about the choice to be small in order to protect the things that mattered. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the locker and left the supply room and didn't look back. Inside the building at that same hour, in the northeast corner office where the desk lamp was still on, Victor Langford sat across from a man he'd been introduced to through Cole as a crisis consultant and who had not given a last name. "She'll be unreachable for at least 48 hours, the man said. He was composed in the way of someone who had done this before, not excitable, not theatrical about it. "That's the window." "The board call tomorrow, Victor started. "Cancel it. Reschedule for Thursday. Cite a technical issue. By Thursday, the situation will have developed enough that you can call an emergency session under the Charter's Section 12. Incapacitation of the chief executive." He said the phrase without inflection, like a weather forecast. "You have 4 confirmed votes?" 5, if Hendricks comes around. "He'll come around when there's no Natalie Sterling to argue back." The man stood. "Cole will handle the security records. The garage footage will be a maintenance failure. By morning, you'll have a clean narrative." Victor picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. He wasn't comfortable. He'd never claimed to be comfortable with this, but he'd been watching Natalie Sterling make decisions for 3 years that he considered short-sighted and personally insulting, and there is a particular kind of professional resentment that, given enough time and the right opportunity, will dress itself up as principle. "And the janitor?" Victor said. The man looked at him. "What about him?" "He was here late tonight. He might have seen something." A pause. "The janitor is not your concern," which was, Victor Langford would later reflect, the most comprehensively wrong thing anyone had said to him in a career full of bad predictions. Logan left the building through the loading dock on the south side at 9:23 p.m. He moved through the alley behind the building and onto 6th Street and stood for a moment in the cold, hands in his jacket pockets, thinking. Cross would not be in the city. Too exposed. He'd use a location that offered containment and distance, close enough to manage, but outside the immediate response radius. The Delaware River had industrial infrastructure along its banks, warehouses that had been repurposed or abandoned over the past decade as the waterfront development moved north. Logan had mapped this city when he chose it, the way he mapped every city he lived in, not because he was paranoid, but because the habit was by now as natural as knowing where the exits were in a restaurant. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, "Logan." Natalie's voice, controlled but tight in a way that told him she was working at the control. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm in a room. I don't know the building, but there's water. I can hear it. River or harbor, I can't tell which." "How many?" 4 that I've seen, maybe more outside." "Can you talk freely right now?" "For a minute. They gave me the phone." She stopped. "Logan, they know who you are, not what you did here. Who you were. The man in charge, he called you by your rank." Logan said nothing. "He wants you to come," she said. "That's the point of this. He said..." She lowered her voice further. "He said, if you don't come by morning, I stop being useful. That's not going to happen. I know that." A pause. "I know you're coming. I'm not..." I'm not calling to tell you to come. I'm calling because... She stopped, started again. Because I've been sitting here thinking about this morning, in the parking garage, when I got on the elevator and you were... Natalie, I just need you to know that I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day and I kept thinking there would be time to do it differently and... Hey. His voice dropped. Not soft exactly, but different. The register he used only for her and for Ellie. We're going to have that conversation when you're out of there, not on a phone, not like this. A long silence. Okay, she said finally. I need you to do something for me. Whatever you can observe yet, sounds, smells, how long you were in the car, which direction you felt turns happening. Tell me now. She told him. She was precise about it, more precise than most people would be, because Natalie Sterling's mind was not the kind that collapsed under pressure. It was the kind that focused, that gathered data even when the data was terrifying, that treated information as the first line of any response. He had loved her for a lot of reasons, but this was somewhere near the top. 40 seconds of driving. 1 left turn, 2 rights. The smell of diesel and something that might have been treated lumber. A particular pattern of echo when the guards walked. Concrete, high ceiling, hollow beneath it suggested wood flooring above or a raised loading platform. Logan had what he needed. I'm going to find you, he said. I know. Another pause. Tell Ellie her drawing is on the fridge, the one with the 3 of us. I want her to know I look at it every day. He closed his eyes for 1 second. I'll tell her. The line went dead. He put the phone away and stood on 6th Street in the cold Philadelphia night and looked north, toward the river, and began to move. The Delaware waterfront at night was a different city. 2 miles north of the tourist development, past the restaurants and the renovated piers and the string lights that made the river look romantic in photographs, the waterfront turned industrial and honest. Warehouses that had once moved coal and steel and manufactured goods sat in various states of abandonment or repurposing, their loading docks facing the black water, their interiors smelling of rust and old timber and the particular cold that seeps into concrete and never fully leaves. Some had been bought by developers who hadn't yet gotten around to demolishing them. Some had been leased cheaply to operations that didn't require much in the way of amenities. Some just sat. Logan moved along the river road with his hands in his jacket pockets and his footsteps quiet on the broken asphalt. He wasn't running. Running drew attention and burned energy he might need later, and the math Natalie had given him, 40 seconds of driving, 1 left, 2 rights, diesel, treated lumber, concrete echo with a hollow beneath, had already narrowed the geography considerably. There were 4 structures in the relevant radius that matched the profile. He was eliminating them in order of probability. The first 2 were wrong. One was actively occupied by a pallet company whose night shift was audible from the road. The other had no loading platform, just a ground-level concrete pour. The third was a former cold storage facility that had been empty for 2 years, sitting behind a chain-link fence with a padlock that had been replaced recently. The old lock still hung on the fence post, its shackle cut clean, while the new one was a commercial-grade unit with a shrouded body. Someone had changed that lock in the last week. Someone who planned to use the facility and didn't want to be bothered by the existing hardware. Logan stood at the fence line and looked at the building for 3 minutes without moving. 2 windows on the upper level with light behind them, one covered with something dark, a tarp or heavy plastic. Ground floor, no visible light, but the double loading doors on the riverside were closed, and the gap beneath them showed a faint warmth that meant the interior was heated. 3 vehicles parked on the north side of the building, backed in. A generator running somewhere inside. He could feel the low vibration in the soles of his feet more than hear it, which meant it was well insulated, which meant this location had been prepared with some care. 1 guard visible, moving along the south perimeter. Steady pace, no variation, 22 seconds for the full circuit. Logan counted 2 full circuits. 22 seconds, 22 seconds. A professional habit, one he'd seen in trained security and sometimes in ex-military. He'd also seen it mean that the guard had stopped actually looking at what he was walking past. He moved to the fence at the north corner, away from the circuit path, and went over it in under 4 seconds. Inside the warehouse, Natalie had been counting things. It was what her mind defaulted to under stress, quantifying, cataloging, measuring. In the first hour after they'd brought her here, she'd counted ceiling joists, 14 visible, guard rotations, approximately every 30 minutes, 3 different men cycling through. And the number of times the man she now knew was in charge had looked at his watch, 7. She'd also noted the position of every door she could see from where she was sitting, the location of the single working light above her, and the fact that her restraints, zip ties around her wrists, looped through a metal bracket bolted to the floor, had been installed with her hands in front of her rather than behind, which was either careless or overconfident. She'd been working at the left tie for 40 minutes. Slowly. Not obviously. The bracket was solid, but the bolt had some play in it, and the concrete around it was old enough that she'd felt the faintest give when she'd tested it. She didn't know if she could get free before Logan arrived. She didn't know when Logan would arrive, but she knew, with the specific certainty of having shared her life with him for 18 months, that he was already moving. The door opened and the man walked in. Damian Cross was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture from what Logan had told her, which wasn't much, a few details over the course of several conversations, the way he sometimes talked about his service in fragments rather than full accounts, and she'd assembled something large and theatrically menacing. The man who walked in was average height, slightly soft around the middle, with the tired face of someone who traveled a great deal and slept badly. He was maybe 50. He wore a dark jacket and carried a paper cup of coffee, and when he pulled a folding chair across the floor and sat down in front of her, he moved like a man who had all the time in the world. "You look like you're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "That's what everyone says about you." He looked at her without hostility. "Smart, driven, built something real. I mean that. I respect competent people." A pause. "Your husband was competent too. Is competent. His name is Logan Hayes." "I know his name." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I've known his name for 9 years. Did he ever tell you about the Djibouti operation?" "Some of it." "He dismantled something I spent 6 years building. Not his whole team. Him. He was the one who identified the pattern, ran the source development, built the case from nothing. The others executed. He designed it." Cross turned the paper cup in his hands. "I don't hold grudges against people doing their jobs. That's not productive. But Logan Hayes was thorough in a way that cost me more than money. I had people I trusted in that network, good people who went to prison because of how thoroughly he worked." "People who kidnapped other people for money?" Natalie said. "Yes." He didn't flinch. "People in a business I ran who got caught because Logan Hayes is very, very good at what he does." He looked at her directly. "Which is why you're here. Not because of you specifically, because of him. You want him to come for me." "I want him to come here, yes." "So you can kill him." Cross considered this. "I want him to understand what it costs to take things from people who remember. After that," he shrugged, "he can make choices about what happens next. I'm a businessman, not a sadist." Natalie looked at him for a long moment. "You've been planning this for how long?" "Getting the access right took about 8 months. Finding someone inside your organization who had his own reasons to help. That was fortunate. The timing aligned." "Langford," she said. Something shifted in Cross's expression. Brief, but she caught it. He hadn't expected her to get there that fast. "I didn't say that." "You didn't need to." She kept her voice even. "Victor Langford has wanted my position for 2 years and didn't have the leverage to take it. You provided leverage. He provided access. Cole provided the security gaps." She watched his face. "Am I close?" Cross stood up. "You really are smart," he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, more like an observation a person makes when a variable behaves differently than expected. "I'll tell Logan you said hello when he arrives." "Tell him yourself," she said. "He's probably already in the building." Cross stopped walking. Natalie kept her face still. "He's not," Cross started. "He left the office within 15 minutes of me being taken. I know how he moves. I've watched him move through a 14-story building for 18 months without anyone noticing he was paying attention to everything." She tilted her head slightly. You studied him in the field 9 years ago. I've lived with him. I'd argue I have the more current intelligence. Cross looked at her for a moment, then he walked out quickly. The paper cup still in his hand, and the door closed behind him, and she heard his voice in the hall, tight and sharp in a way it hadn't been in the room, giving instructions she couldn't fully make out. She turned back to the bracket and pressed both wrists down hard, feeling the concrete crumble by another millimeter around the bolt. Logan had been in this building for 11 minutes before anyone knew he was there. The first guard he encountered was on the ground floor near the east wall, warming his hands over a space heater someone had plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord running from the generator room. Logan came up behind him through the dark the way he'd been trained to move. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical silence of action movies, but with the patient, deliberate foot placement of someone who had done this enough times that it had stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like breathing. He subdued the guard efficiently, checked him for additional weapons beyond the sidearm on his hip, secured his hands with the man's own zip ties, and dragged him behind a row of old industrial shelving. He took the sidearm and checked it. Full magazine, chambered round, safety on. He safed it and put it in his jacket pocket. He preferred not to use it. Gunfire in a contained space with a hostage-complicated geometry in ways that paper briefings rarely captured. The second guard came from the stairwell at the north end, moving fast. Someone had communicated something. The pace was wrong for a routine patrol. Logan was already behind cover before the guard cleared the stairwell door. He watched the man sweep the room with a flashlight, pause, move toward the shelving where the first guard was secured. The moment the flashlight beam went down and the guard crouched to look at his colleague, Logan moved. 40 seconds later, the second guard was next to the first. The third man was the problem. He was older than the others, and he moved differently. Not the rote pattern of hired security, but the varied, unpredictable movement of someone who understood that routine made you a target. He was on the upper level, moving along a catwalk that ran the length of the building above the loading floor, and Logan tracked him from below for 4 minutes before identifying the single point where the man's attention consistently moved to the river-facing window. Checking the perimeter, which was understandable, but the consistency of it created a 4-second gap. Logan took the stairs on the south end, came onto the catwalk on the opposite side from the guard's position, and waited. 3 minutes. The man moved. His eyes went to the window. 4 seconds was enough. He secured the third guard against the catwalk railing and moved toward the lighted room at the end of the upper hall, where the tarp-covered window cast thin lines of light through its edges. Thus, he heard Cross in the hallway before he reached the room. Already inside, then sweep the ground floor again, and the ground floor team isn't responding. Another voice, younger, with an edge of controlled panic. What do you mean they're not? They're not answering, either of them. A silence. Then he's already up here, Cross said. His voice had changed. The composed boardroom quality was gone, replaced by something older and more functional. A man who had operated in dangerous situations before and whose body remembered what to do even when his mind was surprised. Get her ready to move, back exit the boat. The river exit? Now. Logan heard footsteps moving away from him toward the door at the end of the hall. He moved faster. He came around the corner and Cross was standing in the hallway, alone, and they looked at each other for the first time in 9 years. Cross was holding a gun. Logan had the guard's sidearm in his jacket, but his hand wasn't on it. You came faster than I expected, Cross said. You built a good trap, Logan said. Bad timing. I've had 9 years to build it. I know. Logan kept his distance. Not out of fear, but because Cross was a man who shot people when they moved unexpectedly, and the priority right now was Natalie, not Damian Cross. Where is she? Being moved. Call it off. Cross almost laughed. It came out wrong, too much air behind it. You broke into my location, put down 3 of my people, and you're asking me to call something off. That's a strange negotiating position. I'm not negotiating, Logan said. I'm telling you how this ends. You call off the move, I take her out of here, and you get to talk to law enforcement instead of making a much worse set of choices. And if I don't? Logan looked at him. Then I go through whatever's between me and that door, and the outcome is the same except you don't get the option. Cross kept the gun on him. His hand was steady, which meant he'd done this before, which Logan had assumed. "You've gotten soft," Cross said. 9 years ago, you wouldn't have come in here alone on a rescue. You'd have had a team. You'd have had an exit plan." "I have an exit plan." "What is it?" "Walk out the front with my wife." The gun didn't waver, but something in Cross's face shifted. A fractional recalibration, the look of a person updating a model that wasn't matching reality. He'd planned for Logan Hayes, the former SEAL, the calculated operator, the institutional asset. He hadn't quite planned for Logan Hayes, the man who had spent 18 months mopping floors in order to be near the people he loved. "You're not what I built this for," Cross said, and it came out sounding almost disappointed. "I know," Logan said. "That's the problem with building traps around who someone used to be." Cross fired. Logan had already moved, not away from Cross but sideways and forward, inside the angle, the way you move when the distance is too close for running to help. The shot went past his left arm and hit the wall behind him. The gun came down in the next second, Logan's hand on Cross's wrist, and then they were in close and the gun was no longer in Cross's hand, and Logan had him against the wall with an arm across his chest and his wrist locked at an angle that made further movement a very painful exercise. Cross made a sound through his teeth. "Finish it," he said. "You should finish it. 9 years and you came this far." "I have a daughter," Logan said. "I'm not carrying anything else home." He hit Cross precisely enough to take him off his feet, found the zip ties in his jacket pocket — he'd kept the extras from the guards — and had Cross secured in under a minute. He left him against the wall and went through the door at the end of the hall. The room beyond was lit by a single work lamp on a stand, the concrete floor cold, the walls bare. The bracket in the floor was still bolted, but the zip tie had been cut. Not by anyone coming to move her, but by Natalie herself, who was standing on the far side of the room with a length of metal conduit she'd apparently pulled from the wall and was holding at a defensive angle. She lowered it when she saw him. They stood there for a second. Neither of them moved, the way sometimes happens when the thing you've been bracing for finally arrives and the body needs a moment to recalibrate between crisis and relief. Then she crossed the room and he met her halfway, and she put her face against the side of his neck, and neither of them said anything for a moment that felt longer than it was. Her wrists had shallow cuts from the ties. Her knees were dirty from the concrete. Her hair had come down from whatever arrangement it had been in at 8 that morning. He felt her breathing, harder than she was probably letting herself show, the controlled exhale of someone who had been holding a great deal in for a couple of hours. "You were already loose when he tried to move you," Logan said. "I got the bolt out about 10 minutes before you came in." She stepped back far enough to look at him. "You're bleeding." He looked at his left arm. The shot had grazed rather than missed entirely. A shallow channel through his jacket sleeve and the skin below it. Not serious, bleeding less than it had probably seemed when it happened. "It's fine," he said. "That's not what fine looks like." "It'll keep." "Logan? Natalie." He said her name in the same register she'd heard in the phone call earlier. The one that wasn't quite soft, but was different. "I'll deal with it when we're out. We're not out yet." She looked at him for another second, then she nodded, and he recognized in that nod the same thing he'd always appreciated about her. She argued when there was time to argue, and she moved when there was time to move, and she could tell the difference. "There's a man on the riverside," she said. "He had a boat." "How many?" "I only saw one. He didn't look like the others. He was young, more scared than the rest." "Cross is in the hall, secured." He handed her the guard's sidearm. "You know how to use that." She took it without hesitation. He'd taught her at a range in upstate New York, a weekend trip 6 months into their relationship. Not because he'd expected this, but because he'd expected something, and preparation was the only answer he knew for uncertainty. She checked the chamber the way he'd shown her and held it low at her side. "There are 2 more of Cross's people unaccounted for," he said. "Probably the river exit and 1 other. We go down the south stairs, not the north. The south stairs come out near the loading dock." He looked at her. "You've been mapping the building." "I've been sitting in here for 2 hours. Of course I've been mapping the building." She met his eyes. "South stairs, loading dock, then what?" "Then the fence line and the road." He looked at her wrists again. Can you run? Can you? She nodded at his arm. Yes. Then so can I. Damned. They came down the south stairs fast and quiet. Logan first, Natalie close behind. The ground floor was still dark except for the space heater's orange glow across the room, the first two guards still secured behind the shelving. Logan moved them toward the loading dock doors on the riverside, and they stopped just before the doors, listening. Wind off the river, water against the dock pilings, the low groan of the building's metal frame, and someone on the other side of the door, shifting weight, foot-scraping concrete. Logan held up one finger. Natalie nodded. He put his hand on the door handle, felt the latch, and pulled it open fast and stepped through. The man outside was young, mid-20s, jacket too thin for the temperature, a handgun held in both hands but pointed at the dock rather than the door because he'd been watching the river, not the building. He spun when the door opened and Logan was already past the angle of the gun and had his arm, and then the gun was on the dock and the young man was breathing hard with his face against the cold concrete of the dock surface. "Don't," Logan said. "Just don't." The young man didn't. He went still and made a sound that was almost entirely fear and very little else. Natalie came through the door and looked at the scene, and then looked at the river, and then looked back at Logan. "There's a phone in his jacket," she said. "I need to call the police." Logan patted the young man's jacket, found the phone, handed it to her. He secured the young man the same way he'd secured the others, and stood up and looked out at the river while Natalie made the call. The Delaware was black and enormous in the dark, moving the way large things move, slowly and without particular concern for what was happening on its banks. Across the river, New Jersey's lights made a low orange smear on the horizon. He heard her on the phone behind him, clear, precise, giving the address and the situation in the measured cadence of someone who had once explained a biotech acquisition to a room full of hostile investors and wasn't going to let an armed kidnapping be more stressful than that. She gave them Cross's name. She gave them Langford's name and Cole's name and told the dispatcher that those two were connected to the event and needed to be located immediately. When she was done, she stood beside him at the edge of the dock, and they both looked at the water. "How many did you put down?" she asked. "None of them are dead." She looked at him. "How many total?" "5 including Cross. The boy here makes 6. She was quiet for a moment. "You came in alone." There wasn't time for another option. "Logan," her voice was careful, "you came in alone to a prepared location against 6 armed people to get me out. It worked out." She stopped. Something in her expression moved in a way she didn't bother controlling, which was unusual for her. He'd seen Natalie Sterling cry twice in 18 months, and both times she'd seemed surprised by herself, like her own emotions were a department she didn't always have authority over. Her eyes were bright now in the dark, and she pressed her mouth flat for a second before she said anything else. "You could have been killed." "I could have been," he agreed, "and you still came." "Natalie." He turned to look at her fully. "Where else would I have gone?" She looked back at him, and the river moved behind her, and the cold came off the water, and the loading dock was old and rough underfoot. And somewhere back in the building, Damian Cross was sitting against a wall waiting for law enforcement, and the whole night had been ugly and frightening and nothing like the life either of them had imagined they were building. She took one step toward him and said quietly, with the particular quality of something that has been held too long in a closed space and needs to come out, "You are my husband, and I will never hide you again." He heard it, the full weight of it, not the words exactly, but the thing behind them, the decision that had been made somewhere in a concrete room while she'd been working at a bolt in the floor, the accounting she'd done of herself and come up short on, the determination that had come out the other side. He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face. His hand had a small cut on the knuckle from the wall earlier, and she caught his wrist and looked at it and held it. "When we're out of here," he said. "I know," she said, "but I needed to say it now, so you knew before anything else happened." In the distance, coming from the north along the river road, they could hear it, the low building wail of sirens turning toward the waterfront. Logan looked at the door to the building where Cross and his people waited, and then at the fence line, and then at Natalie, who was still holding his wrist with both of her hands, the way a person holds something they've been close to losing. Stay close, he said. That's what I should have been doing all along, she said. The sirens got louder, and the river kept moving, and the two of them stood on the loading dock in the cold and waited for the lights to arrive. The first police cruiser came in hot from the north, lights strobing across the warehouse facade, and Logan stepped forward into the beam with both hands visible and open at his sides. He'd done this before. The transition from operational to legal, the moment you hand a situation over to people with badges and forms and chains of custody. It was never clean. There was always a period of loud, overlapping authority where everyone was simultaneously trying to establish control and nobody quite had it yet, and the smart move was to be the calmest person in that moment, even when you were the one bleeding. Hands where we can see them, both of you. Now. We're the victims, Natalie said with a firmness that probably surprised the officers. My name is Natalie Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling Biotech. I was abducted from my company's parking garage approximately 2 hours ago. The man responsible is inside this building, secured along with 5 of his associates. 2 of them are on the upper-level catwalk, 2 are on the ground floor behind the east shelving unit, and 1 is on the river dock. She paused. You'll want to get an ambulance. My husband has a gunshot wound to his arm. It's a graze, Logan said. It needs stitches. It needs a bandage. Logan, the officer closest to them, young, maybe 28, hand still on his holster, looked between them with the expression of someone trying to determine whether the situation in front of him was under control or whether the appearance of control was itself something to be suspicious of. Ma'am, I need you both to stay right here while we... There's also a man named Damian Cross in the upstairs hallway, Logan said. He goes by other names. He'll tell you his name is something else. He's connected to an international kidnapping syndicate with a federal file. Your dispatch can pull it up. The FBI has been tracking him under Operation Tidewater. He said this with the flat specificity of someone who had briefed law enforcement before and understood that giving them actionable information was faster than arguing about procedure. Call it in before you process us. He's secured, but he's resourceful, and your window to hold him without something going sideways is limited. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio. More units arrived in the following minutes. 4 cruisers, then 2 unmarked vehicles that meant detectives, then an ambulance that parked at the edge of the loading area with its lights on but siren off. The scene expanded the way these things do. Personnel spreading through the building in teams, while Logan and Natalie stood on the dock and answered questions from a detective named Rourke, who was in his 40s and had the specific tired competence of a person who had been awakened by his phone too many times to be theatrical about it. Rourke asked questions in the order that mattered to him: who, what, where, when, and Natalie answered with the clarity and precision that Logan had always found remarkable about her, the way she could organize information under pressure like she was presenting a quarterly report. She didn't editorialize. She gave facts. She attributed claims appropriately. This is what I observed directly. This is what I inferred. This is what Cross said to me, and in what context. Logan answered the questions directed at him in roughly half as many words. When the EMT reached them, Logan let her look at his arm because Natalie was watching, and he knew better than to argue about medical attention in front of Natalie when she'd already decided the argument was over. The graze was 4 inches long and not deep. The bleeding mostly stopped on its own. The EMT cleaned it and dressed it and told him it probably didn't need stitches. And Logan did not say "I told you so" because he was a grown man, and also because the look on Natalie's face when she saw the wound properly in the light was enough to make any small victory feel hollow. "It looks worse than it is," he said. "Stop saying that." "It's true." She was sitting beside him on the ambulance's back step, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and she hadn't moved away from that contact since they'd sat down. He noticed it the way he noticed things, without making it into something, just registering it and filing it somewhere that mattered. Inside the building, through the open loading doors, he could see the activity of the arrest processing beginning. Cross was being walked out by 2 officers, wrists behind him now in proper restraints, and he looked smaller than he'd looked in the hallway. Not diminished exactly. The quality that had made him dangerous was still there, visible in the way he held himself, the way his eyes moved, but contained, reduced to the right size. Cross looked toward the dock as they walked him past. He found Logan's face and held it for a moment. Logan looked back at him and then looked away. Rourke came back with a second detective, a woman named Garza, who had a notepad and a voice recorder, and who was less interested in the sequence of events than in the names. Specifically, Langford's name, which Natalie had already given over the phone, but which both detectives wanted to walk through carefully. "You're saying a senior executive at your company facilitated this?" Garza said. "I'm saying that Damian Cross indicated, without naming Langford directly, that someone inside my organization provided access. When I pulled that thread, the name that fit every variable was Victor Langford." Natalie looked at her steadily. "I also know that Adrian Cole, my head of corporate security, was physically present in the garage when I was taken. My husband has security footage." Logan handed Rourke the USB drive. Rourke looked at it. "Where'd you get this?" "Secondary backup system in the building's 5th floor security office. It runs on a separate circuit from the main feed. The main feed was looped. Someone knew about it and disabled it. They didn't know about the secondary." "You knew about the secondary," Garza said. Not accusatory, curious. "I know that building," Logan said. There was a brief silence in which both detectives processed the particular quality of that statement, the janitor who knew the building's secondary security backup system, and then Rourke put the drive in his jacket pocket, and they moved on to the next question. It was past midnight when they let Logan and Natalie leave the scene, and it was closer to 1 in the morning when a patrol officer drove them back toward the city because Natalie's car was still in the garage at Sterling Biotech, and Logan had left his on a side street off 6th that he wasn't sure hadn't been ticketed. They sat in the back of the cruiser and the city moved past the windows, and neither of them talked much. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because the particular silence between people who have been through something together is different from the silence between people who haven't. And they both understood that the large conversations, the ones that needed to happen, that had been building for 18 months, deserved more than the back seat of a police car at 1 in the morning. Logan called Rosa from the car. She answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping. "Is Ellie okay?" he said immediately. "She's fine. She's asleep. Logan, I've been seeing things on the news about Sterling Biotech. It's being handled. I'll be home in about an hour. Thank you for staying. Of course, should I be? Is everything... It's handled," he said. "I'll explain tomorrow." He ended the call. Natalie, who had been looking out the window, turned to look at him. "She watches the news. She was probably trying to find out why I wasn't home." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Does Ellie know? About tonight?" "No, she was asleep when this started." He looked at his hands. The cut on his knuckle had opened again at some point during the arrest processing and dried. "I'll tell her what she needs to know, not all of it." "She's going to find out," Natalie said carefully. "It's going to be on the news, my name, the company. People are going to make connections." "I know. She's going to have questions." "She always has questions." His voice was even. "She's a smart kid. She handles things better than adults give her credit for." Natalie looked at him. "Like her father." He didn't answer that, but his jaw did the thing it did when he was trying not to show something. The news broke at approximately 2:30 in the morning. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. A police scanner feed captured the call about the waterfront warehouse, and a local reporter who monitored the scanner happened to be awake and happened to know that Sterling Biotech was in the news cycle because of the Mercer acquisition, and happened to make the connection when the name Natalie Sterling came over the dispatch. By 3 a.m. a television crew was outside Sterling Biotech's lobby. By 4, 2 more had joined them. By 6, when Logan had been home for 3 hours and had slept for approximately none of them, there were 7. He knew this because his contact called at 6:15 with an update, and because when he walked to the window of the apartment, their apartment, the one nobody from work was supposed to know about, he could see from the 4th floor the glow of camera lights somewhere in the middle distance toward downtown. He stood at the window in the gray early morning and looked at the city and listened to the apartment breathe around him. Ellie was asleep down the hall. Rosa had taken the couch and was still there. Natalie had fallen asleep in the bedroom sometime around 4, still in her work clothes, not because she'd been too tired to change, but because she'd been on the phone with Marcus for 40 minutes, and then with Sterling Biotech's general counsel for 20 more. and then she'd simply stopped mid-sentence and her eyes had closed. He'd taken off her shoes. That was all. He wasn't going to undress his wife while she slept like she was a problem to be managed. His arm ached at a moderate level that he was choosing to characterize as manageable. The bandage the EMT had applied was still clean, which meant the bleeding had stopped for real this time. He'd taken 2 ibuprofen from the bathroom cabinet, and that was going to have to be sufficient because they didn't keep anything stronger in the apartment on principle. Ellie sometimes had headaches, and he didn't want anything more serious than ibuprofen within her reach. He made coffee. He stood in the kitchen while it brewed and thought about Damien Cross's face as they'd walked him past the loading dock. The particular look of a man who had built 9 years of intention around a single target and was now processing what it meant that the target had declined to behave according to plan. Logan had thought, in the hallway before the fight, that Cross would be more. Not physically. He'd assessed the physical accurately. But there'd been something in his preparation for this confrontation, some expectation that the thing he'd been moving toward for 9 years would have a proportionate weight when it arrived. Instead, Cross had been a man with a paper cup of coffee and tired eyes, making the mistakes that people make when they've been certain of something for too long and stopped accounting for the ways a situation could surprise them. He'd told Cross he had a daughter and that he wasn't carrying anything else home. He'd meant it the way you mean things when you're saying them to someone who needs to understand your decision in real time. But he'd also meant it in a longer sense, the sense of the specific daily practice of being Logan Hayes at 37, which required constant small decisions about what you were willing to carry and what you left at the door. He poured the coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table. He heard a door open down the hall. Ellie came into the kitchen in her pajamas, hair tangled, squinting against the light the way she always did for the first 30 seconds of being awake. She was 10 years old, and she had her mother's jaw and his eyes, and a personality that belonged entirely to herself, assembled from materials Logan couldn't always identify. She stopped when she saw him at the table. "You're home," she said. "Yeah." She looked at his arm, at the bandage visible below his sleeve because he was wearing a t-shirt and hadn't thought about it. Her face did something complicated and then went carefully neutral in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. "What happened?" "Work thing," he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what fine looks like," she said. He stared at her. She was using Natalie's exact words from the doc. She wasn't doing it intentionally. She'd absorbed the phrase from proximity, the way kids absorb everything. He didn't know whether to laugh or to feel the specific mix of complicated feelings that came with recognizing how thoroughly the 3 of them had built a life together that couldn't be hidden by any arrangement of logistics or timing. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He got her a glass of orange juice and sat back down and thought about how much to say. The news would be unavoidable by the time she went to school. If she heard it somewhere else first, in a version he hadn't prepared her for, that would be worse. He told her enough. Not everything. She was 10 and some of the everything was not appropriate for 10. But he told her that someone had tried to use Natalie to get to him, that it was connected to work he'd done a long time ago before she was old enough to understand the word classified, and that he'd gone and gotten Natalie and everyone involved was now with the police. Ellie listened with the focused stillness she always brought to things that mattered. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Is Natalie here?" "She's asleep in the bedroom." Another silence. "She got hurt?" "Her wrists. She's okay." Ellie looked at the table. She picked at the edge of her placemat, which was a habit she had when she was processing something. "Is she going to leave?" she said without looking up. "No," Logan said. "You don't know that." "I do." "Dad." She looked up. Her eyes were very direct. "She's been—" She stopped. Started again, with the careful precision of a child choosing her words because she understood they mattered. "She's never come to anything. You always say she's busy, and I know what that means. It means she doesn't want people to see her with us, so I don't know why last night would change that." Logan sat with this for a moment. He owed her the truth more than he owed her comfort. "She said something last night," he said, "before we knew if it was going to work out okay. She said she wasn't going to hide anymore." He looked at his daughter. "Natalie doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "You don't either," Ellie said, "but things still don't always work out." He didn't have a good answer to that, Because she was right. And because being right about that at 10 years old was the kind of thing that happened to kids who had been through certain experiences. And he was responsible for some of those experiences even when he'd been doing his best. I know, he said. Ellie picked at the placemat for another moment. Then she stood up, got herself a glass of water, and said, I'm going to be late for school. School starts at 8:15. It's 6:40. I want to shower first. She started down the hall and then stopped without turning around. I'm glad you're okay, she said to the wall. And I'm glad Natalie's okay. He watched her go. Whoa. At 8:10, while Ellie was eating breakfast and trying to look like she wasn't listening to the television in the next room where the news was covering the Sterling biotech story with the specific intensity reserved for stories that combined corporate drama with organized crime and a photogenic protagonist, Natalie came out of the bedroom. She was wearing the same clothes she'd fallen asleep in, and her hair was down, and she had the slightly hollowed look of someone who had slept 3 hours after a significant amount of adrenaline. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw Ellie. Ellie looked up from her cereal. They looked at each other for a moment in the way of people who care about each other but aren't always sure what the right vocabulary for it is. Hi, Natalie said. Hi, Ellie said. How's the cereal? It's fine. A pause. There's more in the cabinet. Dad makes terrible coffee, but it's in the pot if you want it. I heard that, Logan said from the living room. It's true, Ellie said. Natalie moved to the cabinet, found a bowl, found the cereal, and sat down at the table across from Ellie. Logan came to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame and watched the two of them eat cereal at 6:40 in the morning and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name but that he recognized, the way you recognize a place you've only seen in photographs. At 8, he drove Ellie to school. The regular morning logistics of it, the backpack, the history book she'd forgotten on the counter, the argument about whether she needed a heavier jacket that she won by pointing out the weather app on his phone, felt strange and necessary simultaneously, the way the ordinary does when you've just come through something that tried to take it from you. When he got back, Natalie was at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her terrible coffee untouched and her phone in her hand, running the crisis the way she ran every crisis, by attacking it with information and sequence and the relentless allocation of attention to the things that could still be changed. Marcus is putting together a statement, she said without looking up. Hendricks from the board called. He wants a call at 10. Are you going to the office? Not yet. I want the scene to be fully processed first. She looked up. The FBI reached out this morning. They want a formal interview about Cross and the syndicate. They're treating this as a federal kidnapping and an international organized crime case. They'll want to talk to me too. I know. She looked at him. Are you okay with that? It's the right thing. Yes. She nodded, looked back at the screen. Victor Langford was arrested at 6 a.m., Cole about an hour ago. They're both in federal custody. She was quiet for a second. I hired Victor 4 years ago. I sat across from him in an interview and thought he was smart and capable, and I wasn't wrong about that. He just turned those qualities in a direction I didn't see coming. People have reasons, Logan said. That's very generous of you. I'm not being generous. I'm just saying the world is full of people who make catastrophically bad decisions for reasons that feel reasonable to them at the time. He sat down across from her. It doesn't make it not their fault. It just makes it comprehensible. She looked at him for a moment. How do you do that? Do what? Stay that even. She closed the laptop. Last night, this morning, you haven't... She stopped. I keep waiting for you to be angry. At me. At the situation. I'm not angry. Logan, I spent 18 months asking you to be invisible and someone used that against you. Against both of us. That has to... I made the choice, he said. The invisibility was my idea first. You know that. You suggested it. I agreed to it for the wrong reasons. She said it clearly, without softening it. He appreciated that about her. She was not a person who softened her own failures to make them easier to carry. You suggested it because of Ellie's safety. I went along with it because I was afraid of what people would say. She looked at her hands. Those are different things. He didn't argue with her because she was right. I told Ellie this morning, he said. That you'd said you weren't going to hide anymore. Natalie looked up. She's 10, he said. She's been watching this whole situation for a year and a half with the particular attention of a kid who's trying to figure out if she's going to get hurt. She needed to hear something concrete. What did she say? She said she was glad you were okay. She also said she was late and went to shower. He paused. Which is about as warm as she gets until she trusts something. Natalie was quiet. Then, she doesn't trust me. She wants to. He looked at her directly. There's a difference. Wanting to trust someone and not yet having enough reason is not the same as deciding not to. A pause. You can build it if you want to. I want to, she said. I should have wanted to 18 months ago. Yeah, he said. You should have. He said it without cruelty, just as a fact, the same way you'd note the weather. But we're here now. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the one with the cut on the knuckle, the bandaged arm resting on the table between them. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he for a moment. And outside the window, the city was fully awake now, and somewhere downtown, journalists were gathering outside a building where he had mopped floors for a year and a half, while everything was building toward last night. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. An unknown number with a 202 area code, which meant Washington. He looked at Natalie. She looked at the phone. FBI or DOD? She said. Could be either. You should answer it. I know. He looked at the number for another second. We're going to be okay, he said. The three of us. I know we are, she said. And the way she said it, not with the brightness of someone trying to convince themselves, but with the flat, certain quality of a decision already made, was the thing he'd needed to hear without knowing he'd needed it. He answered the phone. The FBI interview was conducted at a federal building in Center City that afternoon. 2 agents in a room that looked like every federal interview room he'd ever been in. Institutional carpet, fluorescent overhead, a table bolted to the floor, the particular institutional smell of carpet cleaner and recycled air. Logan sat across from an agent named Pollard and gave a complete account. Not because he was required to, but because Cross was a federal matter and always had been, and the cleaner and more complete the picture he gave them, the smaller the chance that something procedural would give Cross's attorneys a foothold. He went through the timeline, the evidence, the names. He answered questions about his service record, which Pollard had already partially reviewed, and which Logan confirmed or corrected as needed. He answered questions about the security footage, the USB drive, what he'd observed in the building's 5th floor monitoring room. Pollard, at a certain point, looked up from his notepad. Mr. Hayes, you entered a location where an armed kidnapping syndicate was holding your wife, alone, without law enforcement notification. I called law enforcement the moment I had a location, Logan said. I entered because the window was closing and I had the training to manage the situation, and standing on the dock while the window closed was not a viable option. 6 armed individuals. 5 plus the boy on the dock, who wasn't meaningfully armed. Pollard looked at him. And all 6 are alive. Yes. Any particular reason for that? Logan considered the question seriously because it deserved to be considered seriously. I had reasons not to want to carry anything unnecessary home, he said finally. Pollard wrote something on his notepad. Whatever he wrote, he didn't share. Natalie's interview was in a separate room, conducted simultaneously. They found each other in the hallway afterward, and walked out together into the gray Philadelphia afternoon, shoulder to shoulder, through the glass doors of the federal building and down the steps to the street where Marcus was waiting with a car because Natalie had texted him from inside. Marcus looked at Logan. Logan looked at Marcus. This was the first time they'd been in the same physical space with full mutual knowledge of who each of them was, and Marcus managed it with the professional adaptability of a man who had been in communications long enough to understand that surprise was just information you hadn't prioritized yet. The statement's ready when you are, Marcus said. We're recommending you do it live. Your words, no script. The board responds better to, I know what I'm going to say, Natalie said. Do you want to run it by me first? No? Marcus nodded and opened the car door and said nothing else, which was why she'd kept him for 4 years. Tess, she did it that evening from the steps of Sterling Biotech's headquarters, at a podium that Marcus had arranged with the building's glass facade behind her, and the camera lights washing the gray out of the sky. Logan stood to the side, not behind her, not hidden, just to the right of the cluster of communications staff and legal counsel, in a jacket he'd borrowed from Marcus's car because his own had a bullet graze through the sleeve. Natalie spoke for 8 minutes without notes. She covered the events of the previous night factually and in sequence. She addressed the board, the shareholders, and the employees. She acknowledged what she knew about Langford and Cole and confirmed that law enforcement was handling both. And then she paused and looked directly into the camera rather than at the notepad she wasn't using and said, "I want to address something that will come out regardless, and I'd rather you hear it from me. The men who took me last night used my married name to do it, not a name most people know." She paused again, a beat that was completely deliberate. "My husband is a man named Logan Hayes. He has worked in this building for the past 18 months in facilities maintenance, and I did not acknowledge him in that capacity because I was afraid of what people would think. Of him. Of us." She said this without looking away from the camera. That was wrong. It was a failure of courage that I intend to spend a significant amount of time making up for. Logan came to that warehouse last night and brought me home, and the only reason he was in a position to do that is because he is who he is, not who anyone else decided he was. She looked off camera then, briefly, directly at him. "That's all I have on that." She stepped away from the podium before anyone could ask questions. When she reached him, the camera lights were still running and every lens in the cluster was now pointed at the two of them, and Logan was aware of this in the peripheral way you're aware of weather, present, factual, not the thing you're paying attention to. "How was that?" she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Good," he said. Little long on the pause in the middle. "I was thinking." "It showed." She looked at him. Her eyes were tired and her voice was slightly hoarser than normal from the past 24 hours. And she had a bruise coming up on her left wrist from where the zip tie had been. And she was the most real he had ever seen her look standing in front of a camera. "You're critiquing my press conference delivery," she said. "You asked." "I did," she said. "I did ask." And something came loose in her face, not quite a laugh, but the cousin of one. The kind of thing that surfaces when you've been through a great deal and the person standing next to you is the specific person who makes the weight of it manageable. Behind them, someone in the press pool shouted a question. Neither of them answered it. Marcus stepped smoothly into the gap and began redirecting, and the camera lights stayed on, and the city moved around them, and Natalie Sterling stood on the steps of the company she had built and did not move away from the man standing beside her. For the first time in 18 months, Logan Hayes stood in front of this building in full view of the cameras and the lights and the journalists and the evening news cycle and did not disappear. The news cycle, as it always does, made the story into something it partially wasn't. By the morning after Natalie's statement, the version circulating across every major platform had acquired the shape that media gives to complicated things when it needs them to fit a shorter container. CEO's secret husband turns out to be Navy SEAL who saved her life. That was the headline that spread fastest, the one that got the most clicks, the one that reduced 18 months of a real and imperfect marriage into something that sounded like a movie pitch. Logan saw it on his phone at 7 in the morning while he was making breakfast and felt the specific irritation of a person watching their life be summarized by someone who wasn't there for any of it. He made eggs anyway. Scrambled, because Ellie didn't like them any other way, a preference she'd had since she was 4 and that he'd long since stopped questioning. Ellie came to the kitchen and saw the phone on the counter and the headline visible on the screen and said, "Is that about you?" "Partly." She read it. Her face did the complicated thing, and then settled. "They got the important stuff wrong." "Which part?" "They made it sound like the whole point was that you were a SEAL." She poured herself juice. "Like that's why it matters." He looked at her. "What do you think the point is?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things that deserved it. "That you went anyway," she said finally. "Whether you used to be a SEAL or not, you went anyway. He put the eggs on a plate and slid it in front of her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to add. The weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about the aftermath of something like this is clean. There are too many institutions involved, too many overlapping jurisdictions, too many people who need pieces of the story for their own purposes. The FBI wanted Logan for 3 separate follow-up interviews about Cross's network, the syndicate's operational structure, and the intelligence gaps that had allowed Cross to rebuild after Djibouti. Logan gave them what he had, held back what he'd been trained to hold back, and answered questions about the warehouse in the same flat, factual register he'd used in the first interview. Cross's attorneys moved quickly, as expected. They challenged the circumstances of his detention, the chain of custody on the USB footage, and the admissibility of statements Cross had made at the scene. The federal prosecutor's office handled most of this, and Logan's contact from the night of the kidnapping, whose name was Garrett, and who turned out to have a more formal relationship with federal law enforcement than Logan had previously understood, quietly ensured that the intelligence community's file on Cross's activities was made available in a format that didn't require Logan to testify about classified operations. It held. Cross was held without bail as a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. His attorneys filed motions for 2 months, and every motion was denied. And eventually the picture became clear enough that the public defender's office stopped pretending there was a viable defense, and the conversation shifted to terms. Victor Langford and Adrian Cole were processed through a separate but parallel track. The corporate conspiracy charges were straightforward. The calendar records, the looped security footage, Cole's physical presence in the garage, Dennis, the night contractor who made the sensible decision that cooperation was a better long-term strategy than loyalty to people who had never considered his long-term. Langford's attorney tried the angle of coercion, arguing that Langford had been manipulated by Cross's organization and hadn't fully understood the criminal nature of what he was enabling. The prosecutor treated this argument with the respect it deserved, which was not much. The footage from the Northeast Corner office, the conversation with Cross's associate about Section 12 of the corporate charter, about the timing, about the 48-hour window, was not the recording of a man who didn't understand what he was doing. Logan didn't follow the legal proceedings closely. He had learned a long time ago that the institutional machinery of accountability moves at its own pace and gets there when it gets there, and spending your attention on it while it grinds is a way to avoid spending your attention on the things in front of you that actually require it. What required his attention was the orderly reconstruction of a life that had been lived sideways for too long. The apartment in the building 40 minutes from Sterling Biotech had always been a temporary solution. Logan had known that from the beginning. He'd taken a short-term lease on it 3 times, renewing without discussion each time because neither of them had forced the question of what a permanent solution looked like. Now the question forced itself. They had a conversation about it on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, which was where their most important conversations happened, Logan had noticed. Not the bedroom, not the living room, not some designated serious conversation location. The kitchen, with its imperfect overhead light and the water stain on the ceiling that had finally been fixed, and the particular quality of afternoon sun through the east window. "I don't want to keep 2 places," Natalie said. She was direct about it in the way she'd been direct about everything since the warehouse. Not perfectly, not without the occasional reversion to the old careful language, but consistently trying to say the thing rather than the managed version of the thing. "I want Ellie to have a room, a real one, not a place she visits." "She'd want to stay in the same school district," Logan said. "She's finally settled there." "I know. I've been looking at neighborhoods. There's a house in Chestnut Hill. It's bigger than we need right now, and the kitchen needs work, but the school district is the same, and there's a yard." He looked at her. "You've been looking at houses for about 3 weeks. You didn't mention it." "I was afraid if I said it out loud before I was sure I'd—" She stopped. "I'd find a reason not to follow through, so I waited until I was sure first." He understood this about her, the way she made decisions in private before making them in public. It was the same quality that had made the secrecy possible for so long, the same internal processing that had kept him invisible, turned now toward a different purpose. People don't change their fundamental architecture. They redirect it. "Can I see it?" he said. "The listing's on my phone." He looked at the listing. 3 bedrooms, a front porch, a yard that backed up to a tree line. The kitchen did need work. That was visible even in the photographs. The second bedroom had purple walls that whoever had grown up there had presumably chosen, and whoever was selling had decided not to repaint. Ellie would want to repaint the purple, he said. I thought yellow, Natalie said. She mentioned yellow once. He set the phone down. You've been paying attention. I've been trying to. She looked at the table. I missed a lot. I'm trying to catch up. You don't have to catch up, he said. You just have to show up going forward. She looked at him. Is there a difference? Catch up sounds like debt. Showing up is just a decision. He looked at the listing again. Make an offer. She nodded. Then, after a pause, with both our names on it. That was never going to be optional. I know. I'm saying it anyway because I want to. They made an offer, and the offer was accepted after a brief negotiation over the kitchen, which the sellers agreed to credit rather than fix. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which gave them 6 weeks of coexisting in the apartment with all three of them knowing that it was ending and something better was beginning, which was not a bad kind of tension to live in. Ellie's response to the news of the house was characteristic. She listened to the whole explanation, the neighborhood, the school district remaining the same, the yard, the room with the purple walls. And then she asked one question. Do I get to pick the yellow? Yes, Natalie said. Can I paint the whole room or just the walls? What else would you paint? The ceiling. I want a yellow ceiling. Natalie looked at Logan. Logan looked at the ceiling of the kitchen. Sure, he said. Ellie nodded as if this had been a business matter she'd seen to satisfactory resolution and returned to her homework. Natalie caught Logan's eye across the table and something moved across her face that she didn't bother hiding, a warmth that was also the slightly undone quality of someone who keeps getting surprised by how much they care about a 10-year-old's ceiling preferences. She was learning. It was not a smooth process. There were days she came home from the office still running at the frequency of someone who had been managing a crisis since 6 a.m. And she'd miss something. A signal from Ellie that required attention, a moment that wanted presence rather than efficiency. And Logan would catch it, and sometimes tell her directly, and sometimes just handle it, and she would figure it out an hour later and be harder on herself about it than she needed to be. He'd been living alone with Ellie for 4 years before Natalie arrived in their lives in any real sense, and he had systems and rhythms for that didn't automatically include a third person. The integration was not seamless, but it was real. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Every difficult moment in it was real, which meant every good one was too, and the good ones were accumulating in a way that the bad ones weren't going to outweigh. The recital was on a Saturday in March, 3 months after the warehouse. Ellie played violin, which she'd been learning for 2 years with a determination that had started as stubbornness and become something genuine. She was not a prodigy. She was a technically improving 11-year-old. She'd had her birthday in January, with a particular talent for the emotional register of what she played, which her teacher said was rare and more important than pure technical precision, and which Logan had always thought was something she'd developed partly because she'd spent 4 years watching her father try to communicate things he didn't have direct language for. The recital was in the school auditorium, which held maybe 200 people. Logan arrived early and found 3 seats together and saved them by putting his jacket on one and his program on the other, which is the universal language of seat saving that functions only if you have the kind of face that suggests you will not be argued with about it. Natalie arrived 7 minutes before the recital started. Not late. Logan had built in the margin. She was coming directly from a board presentation that had run 40 minutes over, and she had texted him twice with updates. The second one reading, I am leaving this meeting whether they're done or not, which she had done. Her hair was still in its formal arrangement and she was still in her work clothes, and she sat down in the seat next to Logan and exhaled exactly once before finding the program and locating Ellie's name in it. Third, she said. She's third. She'll be good. I know she'll be good. She folded the program carefully. I should have been here for the last one. You were here for this one, like Logan said. I'm saying I know I should have. Natalie. He said it quietly, not unkindly. I know. She knows. We're all aware of the ledger, but there's only one recital happening tonight, and she's in it, and you're here. That's the part that counts going forward. She looked at him, then at the stage. You're going to have to stop being reasonable about this stuff at some point so I can feel worse about it. I'll try to be less reasonable in the future. Please. He almost smiled. She saw it and looked away at the program again, and he looked at the stage and the auditorium filled around them with parents and siblings and the low, excited noise of children being directed backstage. When Ellie came out, third in the lineup, she was wearing the dark green dress she'd chosen for this specific occasion and carrying her violin with the focused seriousness she brought to things she cared about. She found them in the audience before she found her mark on the stage. It took her about 4 seconds, scanning from left to center, and when she located them, both of them together in the same row, something happened in her expression that was over in an instant and that Logan would have missed if he hadn't been watching for exactly that. He'd been watching for it for a long time. She played Suzuki Book 4, the last piece in the set, which she'd told him was the hardest one, and which she'd been practicing with a metronome every evening for 6 weeks. She played it well. Not perfectly. There was a hesitation in the third movement that her teacher would probably mention, but with the quality her teacher had named, the emotional register that made the imperfections not the point. When she finished, Logan clapped. Natalie put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled, which was the kind of thing Logan hadn't expected from her, and which Ellie, from the stage, registered with visible delight. Afterward, in the hallway outside the auditorium, Ellie accepted the compliments of her teachers and the standard congratulations of other parents' children with the somewhat formal graciousness of someone who is pleased but not going to be theatrical about it. When she reached Logan and Natalie, she stopped and looked at both of them, and then she said to Natalie specifically, "You made it." "I made it," Natalie said. "You whistled." "I did." "I didn't know you could do that." "There are a few things you don't know about me yet," Natalie said. Her voice was careful with the yet, the way you're careful with a word you mean to carry a significant amount of weight. "We have time to fix that." Ellie considered this. She had the measuring quality that Logan recognized as her primary mode of assessing new information: patient, thorough, not easily rushed. Then she said, "Okay," and held out her hand for Natalie to carry the violin case. It was not a dramatic gesture. In the context of Ellie Hayes's particular emotional vocabulary, it was enormous. Natalie took the case. They walked out through the auditorium doors and into the March evening, which was cold and clear, and found Logan's car in the parking lot. And Logan got behind the wheel and Natalie got in the passenger seat. And Ellie got in the back and said she was hungry, and could they get the good Mexican place and not the convenient one? And Logan said the good one was 20 minutes away, and Ellie said that was fine, and Natalie said she could eat, and that was that. Gex. The board meeting was the last week of April, 6 weeks after the house closed. It was a full company meeting, not just the board, but the whole organization. 340 employees gathered in the ballroom on the 14th floor for the quarterly update that Natalie had expanded this year to include a broader conversation about what Sterling Biotech was and what it was going to be. There had been some discussion about whether to hold it in the same space where certain of these employees had, in the past year and a half, treated the maintenance staff with a variety of contempt ranging from Langford's deliberate cruelty to simple indifference. The discussion hadn't lasted long. Natalie had decided, yes, this room, because there was something she needed to say in the place where it needed to be said. Logan came in through the main entrance of the building, which he had not done in 18 months. The lobby guard, who had always been professionally courteous to him when he was arriving with the cleaning crew, looked up and registered something. Recognition, adjustment, the flicker of a face recalibrating, and nodded. Logan nodded back. He took the elevator to the 14th floor. He wore his own clothes, not borrowed anything, a jacket Natalie had picked out, and that he'd worn approximately twice because it felt too deliberate for daily life and felt right for today. He found a seat near the back of the ballroom, which was already filling, and he watched the room the way he always watched rooms. Not with suspicion, just with attention, the habit of noticing things that was apparently too deeply installed to switch off regardless of context. He recognized faces. 3 years of cleaning the floors these people worked on meant he knew which executive left their coffee cups on the floor beside the trash can rather than in it, which ones held the elevator when they saw someone coming, and which ones watched the doors close, which ones knew his name, and which ones had never tried to learn it. He wasn't angry about any of it specifically. He was just aware of it, the way you're aware of a room's dimensions. Marcus came to the podium at 10 and handled the logistics portion of the agenda with his usual practiced fluency. Department heads gave brief updates. The Mercer acquisition was on track, restructured after the legal complications of the fall, but intact. 3 new research initiatives had cleared the preliminary funding review. The stock, which had dropped 12% in the days after the kidnapping, had recovered and then exceeded its previous high, which Marcus attributed to investor confidence and leadership stability, and which Logan privately attributed to Natalie being extremely good at her job regardless of what was happening around it. Then Natalie came to the podium. She looked the way she always looked when she was about to say something that mattered. Settled, prepared, with the particular quality of stillness in her face that people who didn't know her sometimes mistook for coldness, and that Logan had always understood was just the face she made when she was completely certain. "I want to talk about something that isn't in the quarterly report," she said. "And I want to do it here because here is where it happened, and I think that matters." The room was quiet. "A lot of you have worked in this building for years," she said. "A smaller number of you treated the people who maintained this building as if they were part of the infrastructure rather than part of the staff. I'm not going to call anyone out specifically because that's not the point of this." She paused. "The point is that the way we treat people who we perceive as beneath us says more about the health of a culture than any policy document or stated value. It tells you what people actually believe when they think no one important is watching." She looked at the room, not at Logan specifically, at the room. "The man who cleaned these floors for 18 months, she said, endured things in this building that I should have prevented and didn't. I didn't prevent them because I was afraid. Not of him, of you, of what you'd think, of whether it would change how you saw me or what I'd built." She said this without apology's softness and without the compensatory hardness of someone performing accountability, just directly, like a fact about herself that she was finished being ashamed of. That was wrong. It was the kind of wrong that's hard to categorize, because it didn't happen in one big moment. It happened in 100 small moments where I had a choice and I made the easier one. She looked at the back of the room then, found him. "I'd like everyone to meet my husband," she said, "Logan Hayes." 340 people turned. Logan did not stand up. He wasn't going to stand up and present himself for inspection. He just looked back. Met the room the way you meet a room when you have nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and the only reason you're here is because the person you love asked you to be. The applause started near the front and moved back the way applause does in a big room. And then it was general, and then it was standing, and Logan sat in it with the specific discomfort of a person who has never wanted applause for any of the things applause usually gets directed at him for, which is the actions and the training and the operation at the warehouse. That was not what this was supposed to be for, but then he thought about Ellie saying they got the important stuff wrong. They made it sound like the whole point was that you were a SEAL, like that's why it matters. He thought maybe the people standing in this room were not, most of them standing for the same reason the headline writers had chosen. He thought maybe some of them, the ones who had watched a man mop hallways for a year and a half without a word of acknowledgement, were standing because they recognized something about what had been in front of them and what they'd done with it. And maybe that recognition was uncomfortable, and maybe discomfort was sometimes exactly the right response to have. He stood up, not for the applause, because Natalie was still at the podium looking at him, and he had spent 18 months not standing up in this building, and he was done with that particular version of invisible. The things that followed took the shape that life takes after the acute events are over, and the chronic work of rebuilding begins. Cross entered a guilty plea in August, after 7 months of legal maneuvering that ultimately went nowhere. The federal charges carried a minimum of 15 years, and the prosecutor's office had communicated clearly that they were prepared to go to trial if necessary, which they were not. Cross sat across the courtroom from 2 federal attorneys and a table of documentation about 9 years of criminal enterprise, and said the words that officially ended his ability to direct anything at anyone from a free position. Logan was not in the courtroom for the plea. He had been asked if he wanted to be present, and he'd thought about it and decided no. He'd said everything he needed to say on a loading dock in November, and being there for the legal formality would have been about something he didn't particularly need, Closure was a word that got used too loosely for something that was actually just the slow fading of a thing that no longer had your attention. Langford received 6 years on the conspiracy charges, Cole 4 on the accessory charges, with the discrepancy reflecting the difference between designing a plan and executing part of one. Dennis, the night contractor, received a suspended sentence and cooperated extensively, which his attorney leveraged into an outcome that was probably better than it deserved to be, but which Logan had no particular objection to. Dennis had been a young man asked to do something small by people who hadn't told him what the small thing was connected to, and Logan had seen that situation before and knew that the people most responsible for it were not usually the ones at the bottom. Sterling Biotech survived. Thrived, eventually, though the word felt too simple for what it actually meant. The slow, grinding work of restructuring the corporate security apparatus, replacing the compromised personnel, rebuilding board trust after 2 members had been shown to have known about Langford's motivations and said nothing before the fact. Natalie did this the way she did everything, by refusing to do it halfway, by staying in rooms where people were angry with her, by not flinching from accountability even when accountability was inconvenient. She also left the office at 6 more often. Not always. There were still weeks when the job required what the job required, and Ellie ate dinner with Logan, and they watched a movie on the couch, and Natalie came home after 9 and sat with them for the last 40 minutes of whatever was on and said she was sorry she was late, and Logan said it's fine, because it was fine, because this was the life and not everything in a life operates on schedule. But she was there for the school play. She was there for the birthday dinner, the real one with the yellow cake that Ellie had requested specifically. She was there for the Tuesday evening in October when Ellie came home from school with a look on her face that meant something had happened socially and which required 40 minutes of patient kitchen table conversation to fully surface. And Natalie sat through all 40 minutes and asked the right questions and didn't try to solve it too fast the way she sometimes solved things too fast. After Ellie had gone to bed that evening, Logan found Natalie in the kitchen with a cup of tea, sitting at the table in the dark except for the light over the stove. "You handled that well," he said. "I almost told her the other girl was being unreasonable and she should ignore her. But you didn't." I stopped myself. She looked at the mug, because I thought about what you would have said, which was probably something like, "She doesn't need you to solve it, she needs you to hear it." That's about right. Is that something you actually say, or did I make that up? He thought about it. I probably said something like that once. "I've been keeping notes," she said. It was partly a joke and partly not. She looked up at him. "I feel like I'm learning the same things everyone else learned when Ellie was 7. "You're learning them now," he said. "Same as always." "Does she notice?" "She notices everything." He sat down across from her. "She hasn't said anything about this specific conversation to me, but she will eventually. She processes things for a few days and then tells me what she actually thought about them." "What will she say, do you think?" He considered it honestly. "Probably that you listen better than she expected." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "That's a low bar." "It's where we are," he said. "The bar goes up from here." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the house with the yellow ceiling, and the kitchen that still needed some work, and the yard that backed up to a tree line. And what was in her face was not the composed executive expression, and not the managed public face, and not even the careful warmth she'd been building with Ellie. It was something older and simpler than any of those, the face of a person who has found out what they're capable of under pressure and is trying to integrate that knowledge into the rest of who they are. "I used to think," she said, "that the fear was about protecting the company. That was how I justified it to myself. If people knew about us, it would distract from the work. It would create narratives I couldn't control. It would—" She stopped. But it was just fear. Regular, ordinary fear of being seen as something other than what I'd spent 15 years constructing. "I know," he said. "I knew that." "You never said it. It wasn't mine to say." He looked at the table. "You had to find it yourself. Saying it for you would have been another version of me doing something for you that you needed to do." She thought about this. "Is that patience or is that strategy?" "Mostly patience," he said. "A little strategy." Something came loose in her face, and this time it was entirely a laugh, not the cousin of one, and it changed the room the way certain sounds change rooms. filled the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the quality of the person making it and what it meant that she was making it here, in this house, at this table, with him. He thought about the supply closet on the 5th floor of Sterling Biotech and the broken light that had never been fixed on schedule. He thought about the mop and the clipboard and the particular quality of invisibility he'd built over 18 months. Not shameful, not diminishing, just the particular shape of what protecting the people you love requires at a given time. He thought about Ellie saying they made it sound like the whole point was that you were a SEAL, and the way she'd said it like it was obvious, like the actual point was evident to anyone who'd been paying attention. The actual point was this kitchen, this woman's laugh, the yellow ceiling down the hall where a kid who had grown up too fast was asleep with her hair spread across the pillow. The actual point was that the things worth protecting aren't always the things that look impressive from the outside. Sometimes they're just a family, imperfect and ongoing. 3 people building something together with the particular slow patience of people who know what it costs when you don't. Logan Hayes had been many things in his life. He had operated in places that didn't appear on commercial maps and done work that had no public record and carried weight that didn't have civilian language. He had also mopped floors and submitted work orders and been talked past in lobbies by people who saw a uniform and stopped looking. Neither version was the whole story. Both were part of a single life that had led, with all its detours and miscalculations, to this specific chair at this specific table. He was not interested in being the headline. He was not interested in the television interviews that had come through Marcus's office, or the speaking offers from 2 different security consulting firms, or the feature profile that a national magazine had been pitching for 4 months. He would do the crisis preparedness consulting work he'd committed to because it was useful and honest and drew on what he actually knew, and he would do it at reasonable hours and come home for dinner when dinner was happening. He was interested in the recital next spring, which Ellie had already begun preparing for. He was interested in the kitchen renovation they were going to start in January, which Natalie had already over-researched and which Logan had mostly agreed with except for the countertop choice, about which they had a persistent and low-stakes disagreement that had become a running joke without anyone deciding it was a joke. He was interested in the Saturdays when all 3 of them were home with no particular agenda, and the morning moved slowly, and Ellie made terrible pancakes with too much butter, and nobody complained about it. He was interested, most specifically, in the ordinary life on the other side of all of it. Natalie reached across the table and took his hand, the same way she'd done on the ambulance step outside the warehouse, and they sat in the kitchen of their house with the light on over the stove. And outside the window, March was still 2 months away, but the cold had a different quality now than the cold by the river had had that November night. Less like a warning, more like just weather, the ordinary kind that arrives and passes and asks nothing of you. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Pancakes," he said. She looked at him. "Ellie mentioned she wants to try again Saturday. The ones last time weren't bad." "They were extremely bad." "The second batch was okay." "Logan, the second batch was also extremely bad." "She's learning," he said. "The bar goes up from here." Natalie looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just had their own words returned to them at an unexpected angle and is deciding how to feel about it. Then she got up and rinsed her mug and turned the stove light off and said, "If she uses that much butter again, I'm getting involved." "That's your right as a parent." She stopped at the kitchen doorway. In the dark of the hallway behind her, the house was quiet and settled and entirely theirs. "You could have just said stepmother," she said. "I know," he said, "but parent is what you are." She stood in the doorway for a moment, and something moved across her face that she didn't manage and didn't try to. And then she went down the hall, and he heard the bedroom door open softly and close, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark for another few minutes and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury. To sit in a quiet house with nothing required of you and nothing threatening the people inside it. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. Outside, the city carried on without them, which was exactly the way Logan Hayes wanted it.